somebody else who's given us a lot of support along the way, Jeff Weiner. Please come on up, Jeff. Hopefully you're back there. Sorry I wasn't able to greet you in the green room. I remember, I'll tell you, this is actually funny to have John and Jeff together because they both really played a role in the creation of this company. In fact, Jeff, remember the time we were sitting in that bar in San Francisco? Boulevard, right. So we had a dinner, Fortune dinner, and I don't know, I think I moderated the dinner or something, but, and after the dinner, I think I was standing there with maybe Adam or Andy or somebody. Adam. It was Adam? Yeah. And you said to me, David, you should start a conference. And I was like, what? Oh, really? And so anyway, thank you for that.
Do you know why else that was noteworthy that night?
What?
That's where I first met Reed.
Really?
Yeah, it was the first time we ever met.
At that dinner?
Yeah.
Oh, so we brought you together. Oh my God.
Yeah, okay.
Well, okay. That's what's supposed to happen when you do this kind of stuff, by the way. So anyway, Jeff runs LinkedIn, which is now owned by Microsoft, but he joined it in December 2008 and helped manage that process, did manage that process. He's been a long-time technology industry executive. I interviewed him for my book because he was very involved with Facebook-related stuff when he was executive in residence at Excel and previously had been at Yahoo, et cetera. So what do you most want to talk about? You want to talk about LinkedIn or you want to talk about compassion?
I'm here for you and them, so whatever.
Well, I love this compassion thing. I'd like you to talk about why you think compassion is an important concept in business.
In business, well, I think it's an important concept, period. We can talk about it first in business, but I think it's applicable for all walks of life. Within a business environment, I think compassion helps on multiple fronts. I think, taking a step back, let's make sure we're all on the same page in terms of how we define compassion. And learned many years ago, there's a clear distinction and delineation between compassion and empathy, which a lot of people, particularly in Western society, have a tendency to use synonymously. Empathy is feeling what another living thing feels. Compassion is putting yourself in the shoes of another person, seeing the world through their perspective, through their lens, for the sake of alleviating their suffering. So put another way, compassion is empathy plus action. So with that in mind, when you think about the importance of compassion within the workplace, first and foremost, when you are putting yourself in the shoes of another person, take, for example, a manager who is putting themselves in the shoes of someone that works for them. Rather than do what managers traditionally do, typically do, especially less experienced managers, where they expect people on their team to do things the way they do them, which is very natural. We're all egocentric, not to be confused with egomaniacal, but we all see the world through our own perspective. A manager, and certainly a manager with less experience who's newly promoted into that role, assumes I've been doing a good job. I'm just going to expect everyone around me to do the same kind of work the same way. And when you do that, you're fitting a square peg into a round hole. It's really important in those situations to put yourself in the shoes of the people that you're working with, to understand their objectives, their dreams, their hopes, their fears, their insecurities, to put them in a position to maximize their strengths, to succeed, to coach them in the areas where they have gaps. And that's a very different way of traditionally managing. Most people just manage through their own perspective. So that's one example. Another example, and I think it's a continuation of that, is when you invest in the success of other people within the workplace, you're investing in your own success. Things are so inextricably linked at this point, whether those are people on your team or another team across.
So that's even more true than it was before.
Yeah, I think as the world becomes more digital, more networked, I think there are all kinds of inextricable links between individuals and teams. So another area where compassion is of significant value is I personally believe that the long-term value of a company is based on the speed and quality of its decisions. And organizations are able to make better decisions faster when their decision makers, take for example an executive team, have trust with one another and are able to communicate in shorthand. So they don't necessarily need to go through all the rigmarole of trying to establish a semantic framework and understand one another's intentions and so forth and so on. And it's interesting, if you were to look at the most valuable companies in the world, largely technology companies, the median tenure of those executive teams is all 14, 15, 16, 17 years.
Sometimes too long. But anyway.
But these people have been working together for a long time, so they're able to establish that trust. An old friend once taught me, trust is consistency over time. I love that definition. And I think compassion helps facilitate that kind of trust, the creation of that kind of trust, and that trust serves as a bedrock to making better decisions faster. I got one more for you.
No,
It's going to be very apt for the theme of your event. And the last one is arguably the most important given the environment in which we're operating. And that is when you're compassionate, not just with the people that work for you or the people that you work with, but for all of the constituents within an organization's ecosystem, and not just its shareholders, but its customers, by way of example. When you're being compassionate and you're putting yourself in the shoes of your customers, the people that are on the receiving end of your products and services, and perhaps even more importantly, the people that don't get access, you're able to better understand proactively the unintended consequences of your innovations, of your technologies. And we've seen all too often recently the unintended consequences of introducing new technology, new products, new services, arguably with the best of intentions, and the unintended consequences that happen subsequently. So by virtue of being compassionate, you can put yourself in the shoes of those people on the receiving end of the consequences and the unintended consequences, and hopefully make better, more valuable decisions for all constituents within your ecosystem.
Oh, I'm glad you said that. So, in other words, if we look at what's gone off the rails in Silicon Valley, it could be laid in part to an absence of compassionate thinking on the part of leadership?
You know, when you frame it like that, potentially, I don't think it's necessarily intentional. I don't think there are people making decisions suggesting they're going to be dispassionate or not care about other people. I think, you know, in certain situations, they may be so focused on the company's stated objective, its mission, its business
Growth,
goals.
shareholder value.
So, exactly right. So where's the shareholder value going to be created from? How do we how do we double the share price? How do we get our revenue growth to accelerate? How do we ensure that margins are expanding?
User growth, yeah.
How do we ensure that the mission is being realized and manifested? And again, arguably, that mission was established with a very positive sense of purpose. But when you start thinking solely about the what, at the exclusion of the how, that's when you start to get into these very difficult situations. And that can be avoided, interestingly enough, by organizations that do at least one of two things, and ideally both. One is when you're establishing that what, when you're establishing the mission. It's really important to recognize that doing well and doing good do not have to be mutually exclusive.
Well, we like to think that might be true.
But it's not. And there are, with a little additional thought, I think it's quite possible to align those two objectives. And when your mission can do both at the same time, it's so extraordinarily powerful, and it creates a lot of virtuous cycles. That's the what. Then there's the how, which is establishing and codifying your culture, the collective personality of your organization, who you are and who you aspire to be, and your values, the first principles upon which you make those decisions that we were talking about earlier. And one of the ways to avoid the unintended consequences of the pursuit of your what is to make sure you're walking the walk on your how, and not just writing the values up on the walls and not just naming your conference rooms after them. But when you're making decisions and you're in the throes of these really difficult discussions, honoring those values and not necessarily pursuing the next dollar of growth.
So talk about some of the most important decisions you've made in LinkedIn, particularly changing strategy, and how that was informed by compassion or compassionate thinking, and why it, if it did, turn into a benefit, and also, is it possible that it translates into revenue and profit growth?
It's a great question. The first example that came to mind immediately when you asked was the way in which we handle member data. And the framework we established, it's coming up on 10 years now. And it started by putting ourselves in the shoes of our members. And by the way, talking about the importance of the how and values, we have 6 codified values. And the first and by far and away the most important of those values is that our members come first. And it's interesting, LinkedIn is a bit unusual insofar as...
That's your first value.
That's our first and by far and away the most important value that we've codified. By far and away the most important. And the reason being, we're a little bit unusual in terms of the business insofar as we have a flagship application that's essentially a consumer platform upon which we've built a series of enterprise applications and enterprise businesses. And those are very different objectives, and those are typically, if you see an enterprise software company and a consumer company, they will have different values, different culture, different way of going about their business, different strategies. And a very astute member of our board years and years ago pointed this out. This is before we went public, and said, Jeff, how do you expect to successfully navigate that? And I said, in part, it's going to be by not just talking the talk on our culture and values, but walking the walk and making sure that we're all aligned, regardless of whether or not you're working day to day on that flagship application or you're a field salesperson out in the field selling these enterprise services and applications. And there's not a member of our sales force. We have a field sales force, 5,000 people strong. There's not a member of that team that wouldn't be able to tell you that the most important value at LinkedIn is that our members come first. Not members only, certainly not members only, the jackets from the 80s, in case anyone, dating myself. But members first, when you're making a decision, when you're prioritizing, when you're trying to figure out where you're going to invest the next managerial cycle or dollar or resource, it's that our members come first. And that's...
So specifics. Give me some specifics and things.
Data. So 10 years ago, starting to understand the ways in which we're going to leverage data, thinking about our terms of service, thinking about communicating our terms of service to our end users, and recognizing, in part by virtue of watching what was happening outside of LinkedIn, some companies that were changing their terms of service quite rapidly, or companies that were being criticized for changing them and not necessarily being as clear with what they were changing or why they were changing. We established this 3 C's framework. And it's still, to this day, something that we honor, and it's one of the most important things we've established. First and foremost is clarity. We want to be extremely clear with the end user as to how we're going to leverage their data.
Transparency, which we were hearing earlier.
You've got to be clear, and it's not just transparency, because David, you can be transparent and bury it in the fine print. Mm-hmm. You can be transparent and communicate in legalese, and we didn't want to do that. So we wanted to be as clear as possible. 2, coming back to this definition of trust, we wanted to be as consistent as possible over time. We didn't want to constantly be churning through our terms of service and confusing people and just whipsawing our end users, our members. And at the time, about 10 years ago, you did see examples of organizations as they were riding their learning curve and trying to figure out how to leverage data. They were just constantly changing. And it erodes trust, because you're introducing inconsistency. So first and foremost, we want to be clear. Second, we want to be consistent. And then third, and most importantly, control. These are the 3 C's. We want to put as much control in the hands of our end users as possible, in the hands of our members, so that if they don't like, for whatever reason, how we're leveraging data or how we're proposing we're going to leverage their data, they can opt out, and they feel like they're in control. And this is not necessarily how to maximize profits in the short term, but I will tell you, having watched how this unfolds over 10 years, it is most definitely a mechanism to maximize the creation of long-term value, because that trust becomes absolutely essential to doing what we do.
Okay, let me ask you a question about that. Is that at all connected to why you decided 9 months ago, which probably most people don't know in here, not to accept any political advertising?
In part, I think member trust, absolutely. You know, we talk about first principles are very important to us. And when we talk about member trust, 3 C's is one of a number of first principles that we have. Another is that with regard to the content that flows through LinkedIn, we're going to be focused on safe, trusted, and professional. And safe implies that we're going to create a safe environment for the member. We're going to try to eliminate anything that's of a harassing nature, ad hominem attacks, toxic content, that kind of thing. With regard to trusted, we're going to try to eliminate wherever possible fakes and those people who are sharing content with an intention to deceive. Professional is a little bit more of a gray area. It's a little bit more subjective, and it is applied on 2 fronts. One is the nature of the content, professional versus personal. Professionally relevant, helps advance your career in some way, shape, or form. The other is the nature of the discourse, a professional discourse, which is we expect people to behave on LinkedIn the way they would behave with their colleagues off of LinkedIn. Political advertising invites, unfortunately, the unintended consequence and increasing likelihood that you're going to be in violation of one, if not more than one of those 3 dimensions.
You know, an interesting thing, too, about LinkedIn, I used to say this about Facebook, what allowed it to succeed was that it had really, some degree, authenticated identity. And I always used to say, and the only other system, social network that really has an identity-based system is LinkedIn. But you are now clearly, of all social networks, the one that has the most authenticated identity, which gives you a lot of advantages, it seems to me, in keeping your system safe.
Yeah, I think when your online identity is tied to your offline identity, there's a consistent recognition that actions have consequences. And, you know, prior to all of this digital media, prior to the rise of social platforms, in the analog world, we conduct ourselves a certain way. And when you're talking to someone, whether it's one-on-one or one-to-many, there's consequences to the things that you say and how you say them. And people are raised like that, and they recognize that. And then all of a sudden you introduce digital technology where your online identity is not necessarily tied to your offline identity. And those same societal constructs that create parameters and create boundaries all of a sudden start to get blurred, if not altogether erased. And so on LinkedIn, you have this very strong relationship and tie between offline and online identity. You also have this idea of the way you conduct yourself on LinkedIn to some extent will influence your career and the way in which you find work. And so there are consequences to actions. And I think that aspect of the professional and safe, trusted, and professional serves our membership quite well.
Okay, there's two things I want to get to before we run out of time. We have 4 minutes. One is...
It's like a TED Talk. Fireside as a TED Talk. It's that.
Whatever.
Very
I don't
short.
care. Whatever you think.
Short.
Whatever you call it. So I'm going to give you a softball to tell you something I'm very impressed that you're doing, and you can tie it back to this compassion thing, and that is, first of all, this idea that you're trying to help people extend their networks who are not traditionally part of the inside crowd, right? And that I really think is important, and I hope you're doing it globally. Talk about that. But I also want to make sure we don't leave without talking about why you're in China, because we've just heard several speakers already this morning talk about, we are failing in our thinking about China. So talk about this quickly, this issue of helping people who are the excluded ones feel more included.
I'm going to start with China, and then we can,
very compassionate.
Then we can close on the network gap and social capital. So with regard to China, it begins with our mission to connect the world's professionals to make them more productive and successful, and extends to our vision to create economic...
Because you are in China, in case anybody doesn't know that.
We established a
very
presence
unusual
in China
among social networks.
5-6+ years ago. Our vision at LinkedIn is to create economic opportunity for every member of the global workforce. The mission focuses largely on knowledge workers, professionals. There's about 770 million, 780 million when you include pre-professionals or students that aspire to become professionals. The vision is much broader than that. It's all 3.5 billion people within the global workforce. Neither the mission nor the vision is parenthetical. It's not to connect the world's professionals or create economic opportunity for every member of the global workforce, in parentheses, excluding China. So the decision to establish ourselves in China was actually quite straightforward. What was far more challenging was how we were going to go about doing it. Recognizing that if you're going to operate in a country, you need to comply with the laws of that country. That's just the nature of the way business is done. And we don't always agree with the values underlying these laws. And in particular in China, when we announced that we were going to be establishing our business in China, we were very, very straightforward and transparent. And we talked about the fact that complying with Chinese law meant at times, very painfully, we would need to potentially censor our members. And to the extent their profiles included information that the Chinese government deemed illegal, we would have to comply with those laws. And to this day, it's one of the most painful things we do. Very thankfully, it's happened a very, very limited number of times, but it's
really?
Yeah, really. Really.
Okay.
But it's painful nonetheless. Now, that is more oriented in terms of our values as individuals, as people, oriented around freedom of expression. To the extent, and LinkedIn was not created as a communications platform so much as it was created as a mechanism to help create economic opportunity. To the extent complying with Chinese law meant we would need to suppress access to economic opportunity, that would be something we would need to revisit. And
so if that
through.
happens, you'll reconsider?
Anywhere in the world, to the extent we can't do what we're trying to do in terms of creating economic opportunity for our members, then we would have to revisit the decision as to where we're doing business and how we're doing business. So that's kind of one of those really important thresholds for us.
Okay, we're really trying to stay on time, and I want you to talk about that other thing. Okay. I know it's a softball compared to
30
the China
seconds.
Thing, but it's so interesting what you're doing.
Speed round. Okay. So I'm trying to figure out a transition. There's not.
Well, the point is that you basically have real. I mean, I'm a guy who went to a very elite college. I'm a white, upper middle class. I've had all the advantages, and I made a company, and I had a good career at Fortune, which was a super elite time Inc. I mean, I'm the classic example of a guy who traded on his connections to succeed, and I know that. But very, very few people who have those kind of opportunities, and you have thought that through and tried to figure out what to do about it.
Yeah. So that vision I was just describing to create economic opportunity for every member of the global workforce, it is built on a belief at LinkedIn amongst our entire team that equal talent deserves equal access to opportunity. And there are systemic challenges, as we're all very well aware, that prevent that from being manifested. Take, for example, widening socioeconomic stratification, or this idea of an opportunity divide, where there's a correlation between household income and the quality of education that people in that household receive. There's a third systemic challenge that oftentimes goes either unnoticed or without the same kind of attention that those other two dynamics receive. And that's what we at LinkedIn have started to call the network gap. And this idea of a network gap begins with a supposition that networks have power, that your relationships, and in this context, professional relationships, have tremendous power and value. And by way of example, we'll do a quick straw poll. David just shared his anecdotal experience. But show of hands, how many of you here in the audience today, at any point in your career, received a benefit or an advantage in terms of understanding a job opportunity, opening a door, connecting with someone who was recruiting? You were able to advance your career by virtue of professional relationship. Just raise your hand. So
Anybody who doesn't
it's
raise their
virtually every hand goes up. So at LinkedIn, we decided to take that a step further, and we understood anecdotally the power of networks. That's in part why LinkedIn was originally founded by Reid Hoffman and the team. So our data scientists rolled up their sleeves and did a little bit of research, and it turns out when you apply for a job on LinkedIn, if you do so and ask for a referral from someone in your network, you're 9 times more likely to get the job. 9 times more likely. So then we took it a step further, and we asked that same team to do the research on who had the strongest networks that would enable them to benefit from that 9x advantage. The results weren't altogether surprising, but they're definitely worth mentioning. It turns out that where you grow up, where you go to school, and where you work are strongly correlated with the strength of your network. By way of example, if you grow up in a high-income neighborhood, you're 3 times more likely to have a strong network. If you go to a top university, you're 2 times likely to have a strong network. If you work at a top company, you're 2 times then again likely to have a strong network. If you enjoy all 3 benefits, you are 12 times more likely to have the kind of network that enables you to be 9 times more likely to get the job, which creates a virtuous cycle for people like David who enjoy that kind of social capital, and creates a very, very vicious cycle for people who are arguably equally, if not more talented at times, but are being shut out of these opportunities by virtue of a lack of social capital. So through products and technology, through programs we're developing to broaden the aperture through which we recruit and hire, and by trying to encourage people to go beyond their traditional first-degree networks and create opportunities for extremely deserving talent that doesn't necessarily enjoy a first-degree relationship with you, we can start to change this dynamic.
See, to me, that is not only a really good, responsible, doing good sort of thing, but it comes out of your compassion logic, but it also will expand your business.
Yeah.
So, wow, what a great combo. And I'm so glad you're thinking that way, and thank you for being